Brief introductions about our speakers. Richard Blurton is a trained archaeologist who specializes in South Asian art, excavating in North Africa, Afghanistan, and southern India. He is the former assistant keeper at the British Museum. Jatindra Nayak is a translator, literary critic, columnist, and editor from Odisha. He has translated many Oriya works into English, and he won the Katha Translation Award for his English translation, The Descent. Can we have a warm round of applause for our panelists? Richard and Jatindra ji, please welcome on stage.
Thank you, Pratiti. I would begin by saying what an immense privilege it is to engage Mr. Richard Blurton in a conversation about his book, India, History of India, or India, History in Objects. And it's a fascinating book. In fact, it's a wonderfully observing volume. And I just went through several pages of the text, and I hope Malabika ji won't ask for the book back. I would like to have a copy. So I would begin by making a few observations, and after that I will request Richard to make a PowerPoint presentation about this wonderful volume. Generally speaking, I think we all think of history as a record of human achievements. We think of history in terms of rise and fall of dynasties, or the way economic forces unfold and shape human circumstances, and sometimes class conflict. So always the emphasis in history writing is on human agency, what human beings do. So this is something very different, something unexpected, because we don't write the history of objects or write history through objects. In literature, we place a lot of emphasis on objects. The whole novels have been written about a particular object, like Moonstone, or a long poem by Browning is about Ring and the Book. But writing history or narrating or presenting the course of historical events in terms of objects is something innovative, something new, something unconventional. So maybe in the recent past, people are beginning to look at history from very refreshingly different perspectives. And objects now provide a very important starting point. Now there is a museum of material culture. Now in India's history in 75 through 75 objects. So gradually even the British Museum brought out a book in 2010, Richard, History of the World in 100 objects or through 100 objects. So we are now beginning to look at human history in terms of man-made objects. So what do these objects tell us? So before I would request Richard to talk about it, let him make a presentation, PowerPoint presentation on his book, so that you get a general idea of what the book is about. It's a beautiful work of art. The book itself can be seen as a beautiful work of art. One would like to treasure it. It's abundantly illustrated. It's a wonderful visual history of India, compellingly narrated through beautiful and evocative objects. So now over to Richard, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jatin. And can I start just by saying what a great pleasure it is to be back here in Bhubaneswar. We were discussing earlier today when I was last here, and I think it's about 30 years ago. So there's lots to catch up on, and it's, as I say, a great pleasure to be in this city once more. The book that I've published is indeed a history through objects. It's not solely a history through examining texts. In the past, history has been written through examination of texts. Of course, one can't do without that. That provides much of the backbone to history. But I suppose betraying my personal history as an archaeologist, I'm interested in the materiality of things, you know, what they feel like, what they look like, and what they can tell us about people's view of the society in which they lived. So I think this is an entirely valid way of writing a new style of history, if you like. Now, I'm going to show you a very short PowerPoint presentation, which gives you, in a very brief period, a short selection of images taken from the book. So if we could ask Shupriyo at the back, please, to start the PowerPoint presentation, which I may be able to see somewhere. Oh, yes. Forgive me for standing at the front here, but I can see the screen now. The book starts with an object that is 1.5 million years ago. It's a hand axe. It's from the country near, or just outside Chennai in Tamil Nadu. And this tells us something about the very earliest human inhabitants of the subcontinent. As I say, 1.5 million years ago. So this is the opening section of the book. The book is divided into 6 chapters, which are approximately chronological, and this begins it. And of course, the sheer presence of a stone axe in your hand gives you some idea of man's early attempts to forge a place for himself in the new universe, the human universe, the Anthropocene, which was developing. Next, please. Next image, please. Oh yes, thank you. Here, 3 items that you will recognize are not from the Indian subcontinent, but they tell us something about it. These are 3 cuneiform tablets from Iraq, from ancient Iraq, and in it there are descriptions of traders whom we now believe to be the early inhabitants of the Indus Valley. Next, please. In the book, which is entirely illustrated from, the illustrations are all taken from the collections of the British Museum. There's a section on the very remarkable and important early Buddhist site at Amaravati, and the sculpture on the far side is one of the earliest. It's probably about 200 BC in date. The drawing on the other side of the screen is a remarkable drawing by a Tibetan pilgrim to Amaravati who visited in 1940. So we have here 2nd century BC, 1940 AD. And the intriguing thing about the drawing is the fact that in the Tibetan tradition, Amaravati continued to be remembered as somewhere that is important in the story of the spread of Buddhism. So that's why he visited, even though, of course, Amaravati had long since gone out of use as a Buddhist site. Next, please. One can't talk about the history of India without saying something about textiles. And in the book, there's probably, well, I'm not going to say an over-preponderance of textile discussion, because I believe they're incredibly important in this story. But there are plenty of examples. This is probably, this very modest little fragment of a dhari from, it was found in Central Asia at the ancient site of Nia, which went out of use in the 3rd century AD. This little fragment of dhari, woven cotton, certainly came from India and is one of the earliest surviving fragments of dyed and woven cotton that we have actual evidence for. Of course, from Harappa and from the Indus Valley sites, there are impressions of cotton, but this is an actual surviving item of cotton, which makes it so important. Next, please. Later, of course, there are wonderful export textiles. On the far side, a textile exported from Gujarat, probably in the 15th or 16th century, and found in Sulawesi, in Indonesia. So, you know, this is an indicator of the way in which Indian commodities, Indian objects, were valued and traded over very wide distances long before, or certainly before, the Europeans appeared on the scene. The textile beside it is, though, an example of the later European trade, a large chintz, and remarkably on the reverse is a customs stamp from St. Petersburg in Russia, which shows that it was there in 1772. So a very remarkable object. Next, please. Also talking about textiles, I wanted to be certain that non-elite items were as visible as elite ones. So these textiles on the screen here are all from the Banjara community in Andhra and Karnataka. Not well studied, but magnificent in their bright and almost garish aesthetic. Next, please. And then I think the last image here, a painting by Rabindranath Tagore. One of the things that I was especially keen to do in my book was to not only start with the very remote past, but to end with the present day. So there's a considerable discussion about painters of the 20th century. And it's been a great pleasure to discover that Jatin here and I share a friendship with one of Orissa's contemporary living artists, Prafulla Mohanty, whose work also appears in the book. Now, I think that's the last image, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, I am mistaken, I'm sorry. Paintings from the Bengal school, Binod Bihari Mukherjee and Abanindranath Tagore. Next. Oh dear, yes. I'm particularly interested in the way in which popular culture has as important an effect on people's lives as does that of the elite. And if you look closely at this poster, utterly ephemeral object, it's probably the only example to survive anywhere in the world. It's from Pakistan. You can see at the bottom, on the far side, Alexei Kosygin. Next to him, I think probably Bhutto, then an unidentified figure, and then the figure closest to me is Richard Nixon, all caricatured magnificently, and all clasping greenbacks. You know, so there's a lovely narrative going on here. Next. Yes, and again, please. This is the work of Pakistani artists, Shemza on the far side and Ali Kazim on this side. Next. And I think this is truly the last one, a photograph from Bangladesh by the great political activist and photographer, the founder of the DRIC agency in Bangladesh, Shahidul Alam. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to return to a conversation, but this just gives you an idea of the sort of coverage in the book from the remote past right up to the present day. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for crafting such a compelling narrative of our past through objects, because our memories are deposited in objects, and objects provide us fascinating byways into memory. And So I'll play a devil's advocate for a while and ask you a question which might challenge you for a while, but I'm sure. I think our attitude towards British Museum or Western museums is conflicted. We admire them. They are great repositories of the treasures of world, architecture, paintings, sculptures, objects, man-made objects, but they also carry a history of appropriation, history of looting, history of taking objects away from areas they colonized. In fact, when the British Museum took its exhibition to different parts of the world, some people raised objections to the idea that Elgin marbles, for instance, have to be returned to Greece. So, how do you respond to this idea of British Museum turning into a repository of objects of art or objects on which other countries, former colonies, countries which were rendered servile to the empire, so what kind of claim they can make on these objects? And is there any ambivalence on your part or on the part of people who run the museum towards this very uncomfortable question?
I often get asked this question, you won't be surprised. I should also just say before going further, I'm now retired, so I can perhaps say anything I like, but I should first of all, I think, start by saying that for many years now, the British Museum has been a signatory to the UNESCO Convention on Cultural Assets, and so we haven't acquired anything, certainly in my time at the museum, which is about 40 years now, that hadn't got a long provenance and before 1970. Now, that only addresses a small part of your question, but it is an important element. We do indeed consider the history of an object with great care. Having said that, of course, many things came into the museum in the 19th century when such considerations, no one had such ideas then. Fortunately, from this country, which is where I've spent most of my professional life, in this country, they were actually, the colonial presence, for the most part, people were shockingly uninterested, I'm afraid to say. And we do have wonderful collections from India, but the museum was founded more than 250 years ago. You would have thought that there might have been rather more, rather than is actually the case. Now, it's true we have wonderful sculpture from Amaravati, which, when it was first discovered by a Scottish surveyor, Colin Mackenzie, was actually being mined by a local zamindar for building stone. And we do also have wonderful collections from the character Major General Charles Stuart, who was known in his time as Hindu Stuart. He was a great devotee of Indian culture, and he made a wonderful collection. And the sculpture from that is indeed in the museum. Although it's wonderful, it is actually, of course, but a pale reflection of what you can go and see here in the State Museum in Bhubaneswar or in the Indian Museum in Calcutta, because on the whole, people were not greatly interested in Indian sculpture and Indian culture in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The great area where they were interested, and you will quickly understand this, was in Gandhara sculpture. So sculpture from the far northwest of India, which is really a sort of provincial Roman style rather than anything very Indian. And I suspect that people collected this because they recognized the classical Roman and Greek elements in it. And frankly, there were no difficult, multi-headed deities with large numbers of arms which people couldn't understand, sometimes doing unmentionable things. So actually that was a serious disincentive. Now, I must also mention, though, that for many years now, the museum has looked at itself as a lending library. So we are keen to lend our objects all over the world. Our only requirement is that our conditions of loan about safety and temperature and humidity control and security are all covered. And finally, I should say that restitution or repatriation of objects does very occasionally happen. In the 32 years I was at the museum, it happened only once. So that's one time in 32 years. So this process is very, very time-consuming, if it happens at all, and it's very consuming of time and resources and, above all, emotion. And I feel that it's probably better in the future, as I'm retired now, I can say this, I think it's better for our colleagues to collaborate and cooperate on joint projects which can be realized immediately than shout at each other, basically. And it's often, of course, a discussion between the deaf. One side is not listening to what the other side says. So I think cooperation, collaboration, joint research projects, lending objects, training and exchange of staff, these, frankly, can be organized tomorrow and are more productive. So lots of, a very roundabout way to cover your question.
I think I went through a review of your book, which was at once laudatory, admiring, and a little hostile. So at one point in your book, you say that South Asians, in fact, let me explain that your book, India, in the title of your book, actually means South Asia. Yeah. Okay? Not the contemporary political India. So you say that, well, South Asians constitute nearly 1/5 of the world's population, and they are now living as immigrants in many parts of the world. So we should know as much as possible about other cultures, otherwise we are reduced. Yeah. That's your expression. So this reviewer says that, well, you are not writing these books for South Asians, you are writing these for your people who now have a South Asian as a prime minister. So since these South Asians will overrun many parts of the West, you are preparing them to understand South Asian culture so that they will live happily ever after.
Well, of course, it's certainly true that, as you've mentioned, people from South Asia only make up 1/5 or 1/6 of the world's population. So that still leaves a very large population that isn't of South Asian origin, and they need to know about Indian culture. And so I think that the book is indeed partly aimed at them, but also I think, or I've been told by people I meet here in India, that this book also provides a different and a new way of looking at history, and that they're pleased to see many of the topics discussed that perhaps aren't usually discussed in histories. So I hope it is useful here. I should add that it is on sale here, so I hope we see a few copies shifted. Yeah, it's obviously the constituencies are several.
I absolutely agree with you, because as a South Asian, I also find the book a revelation. I learned so many things. For instance, it was such a pleasure to see those 3 paintings by Prafulla Mohanty included in your volume. At one point in your narrative, you say that secular architecture I think, was introduced by the Mughals or the Islamic rulers of India, and then the British. And although secular architecture existed in India before these people came, these rulers came, it vanished for some reasons. Would you please elaborate on that? Because that's a fascinating point about your book, that secular architecture came to India or became established in India after the advent of the Mughals and the British.
I should just qualify what you said, because of course there was secular architecture before. We know from the sculptures of Barhut and Amaravati and Sanchi and so on that there were plenty of secular buildings, but they were invariably of wood. And that's why they don't survive today. So we don't have the wooden palace equivalent of the Brihadishwara temple at Tanjore, for instance. If only we did, how wonderful that would be. You know, it must have been a spectacular building, but it doesn't survive. And that must be the case in many other parts of India. I mean, where did the Eastern Gangas here in Orissa live? There must have been wonderful palaces.
No palaces survived.
Exactly. The use of stone seems to be something that comes in with the first slave dynasties in Delhi.
You also made a fascinating observation about South Asia, that South Asians see life in Technicolor. So I would like you to expand this statement for the benefit of our audience.
I think when most people in Europe think it's chic to dress in black universally, and you then come to India, where people, especially at holiday time, or especially where when some celebration is taking place, people go out in their most wonderful costumes. I can see several examples here this evening. That is for someone who comes from a cold, rainy, overcast climate in the UK, this is a wonderful aesthetic experience. And people who play with Holi and so on, this is all about colour. And if you study Indian paintings, you can't help but be mesmerized, entranced by the way in which colour is used, often rather clashingly according to a European aesthetic, but which give you a real jolt, a real excitement when you see it on the page. So I think there is an innate understanding of colour in the South Asian psyche, which even 2 centuries of British rule didn't erase.
Thank God for that.
Yes, I agree.
You also, I think, made another fascinating observation about India or South Asia, that its popular culture has many rich dimensions. And you talked about textiles, but I think films or popular culture. So what is your take on that? How did it contribute to this kaleidoscopic visual history of India? How do they contribute or deepen our understanding of a narrative history, a history through objects? Yeah.
Well, I was very conscious as I was preparing this book, and also in the years leading up to it, my last 5 or 10 years at the museum, that there were certain lacunae in our collections. We couldn't really talk about the film industry. So how can you talk about South Asia in the 20th century and not speak about the film industry? Huge, huge gap. Fortunately, we were in a position to make some additions to the collection which are reflected in the book, and I feel it's absolutely essential, not only for the present but also for the future, for Indian film to be properly documented. I mean, we can't do it nearly as well, of course, as you can here, but we have something like 6 million visitors every year, and to be able to use our collections as a sort of advertisement, a window on Indian culture, I think has some value. And similarly with music. A couple of years before I retired, in 2018, we were very, very fortunate in receiving from the widow of Pandit Ravi Shankar one of his sitars that had been made in Calcutta. And so this on display can tell our whole audience not only about the importance of Indian music, but also the way in which Indian music has triumphed around the world and seduced ever so many people into wanting to understand Indian culture.
Thank you, Richard, for opening up a wonderful perspective, such a refreshingly new perspective on my own culture, South Asian culture. I learned so much from the book and from whatever you said here today. Now I think we should invite members of the audience to ask questions to Richard, and I'm sure you have many questions in your mind, and you are welcome to ask questions.
I actually have a couple of questions, but the first question, I wasn't very clear about something I wanted to ask about secular architecture in India prior to Mughal and British rule. It did not survive, you said, because it was, why, I mean, what was the reason?
Because it was mostly built of wood. And wood doesn't survive very well in the Indian climate, or not over centuries.
Okay, so most of our secular architecture was wood.
We
before.
believe so, yes.
Okay. Okay, my other, though I would say that also a lot of, I think in the process of, having conquests and a lot of conquests, we probably lost a lot of the secular architecture we had through that process, because we know about the systematic decimation of Delhi. Many cities could have been destroyed like that. They had...
It's no doubt conquest and war by, within India and outside forces also certainly must have had an effect. But for there to be nothing left is, I think, a fairly clear indication.
Thank you. Can I ask another question? Or is there somebody else who would like to ask?
Yeah, Richard here. Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes.
Richard, I just wanted to ask you about craft, because craft, as as distinguished from art, is part of daily living, and yet craft is what is disappearing so very, very strongly, because we've moved to plastics a long while ago, and now it's become exoticized, and it's in fancy homes as part of the show, but it's no longer part of daily living. And there I think we are missing out a great deal of our Indianness, and I'm sure the rest of the world.
I fear you're probably correct. I first visited India now 53 years ago, so I have seen the sort of change that you're talking about. When I first came in 1970, no one had plastic bags. When you went to a shop, you received if it was food or fruit, you would receive it in a paper bag, usually recycled from exercise books or all sorts of different things, or you received it in a little dish made of stitched together leaf. All of that's, or mostly, gone. As someone who's not a citizen of India, it's fairly difficult for me to tell you what to do, but you're right. These things are terribly under threat. I suppose the one area that has seen wonderful resilience is the area of textiles, and the continuation of handloom weaving, embroidery, applique work, kalankari, all these older traditions. Many of these have been nurtured and do continue. So there is some hope there. Whether people will continue to use earthenware vessels for keeping water in, keeping it cool rather than plastic, the future doesn't look very good, I'm afraid. If you travel in the interior and you go to a village, most women going to the well will collect their water in plastic rather than in earthenware or in metal. So it's a very mixed and not entirely happy situation, I think. I'm sorry to be a bit gloomy.
Any more questions? Yeah. Okay, I think, yeah.
So I must first congratulate Mr. Blurton for having displayed the bicycle of Nobel laureate Amartya Sen at the entrance of the British Museum. So you have done a good work, sir. Sir.
Sir.
Do you follow, sir?
Yes. What's your question?
I'm happy to know that, sir, British Museum has displayed Mr. Amartya Sen Nobel laureate's bicycle at the entrance of the British Museum. So that is in honor of a Nobel laureate who hails from India. Number one. Second question is, sir, it is Solon Pollock who said, Columbia University professor, Indians will gradually forget the Indian philosophy, forget India's tradition, forget India's style, and everything Indian will go away, and only thing that will remain, and India will be reduced to a political entity. Is it correct?
If I've understood your question correctly, it's very pessimistic, and I don't fully agree with you. I find that when I visit India, which I do regularly, almost every year, and when I was at the museum 4 or 5 times a year, I still find the difference between the UK and India to be very significant still. And a lot of that is down to the traditional way of life, whether it's in dress or cuisine or in craft activity or in literature. I mean, I think it's incredibly powerful that here in this state there can be a literary festival where works of literature, which sadly I can't read or understand, are published and discussed in local languages. And that seems to be a terrific demonstration of the continuance and power of local Indian culture.
Actually, this is not a question. I just want to appreciate your having narrated your book through objects. And I also want to disagree with the compare here a little, in the sense that we truly owe it to the British or to the Europeans for having, in many ways, giving us back our history and archaeology. And I know it might not sound very patriotic and nationalist, but I think that's okay. And I think more important than the place where the object is, that the object has been preserved with all its, in all its, what is the word for that? With care and respect. So when I very often when I travel to American or European museums and see the kind of preservation work that has been done in your countries and the kind of books that you've written, honestly, is not the kind of literature or is not the kind of archaeological work that has been done here. So, and I think your book is excellent. So, thank you.
I'm honoured to hear you appreciate my book. Thank you very much. Perhaps I could just add one point about the duty of museums today, and which perhaps is pertinent for any museum professionals in the audience today, and that is the importance of the museum database, the putting of collections online so that the public can see them. At the British Museum, when I retired in 2018, now 5 years ago, we had 3.5 million individual object records online. So you can go to our database. Anyone who has one of these or a laptop can call up our database, can read the descriptions, find out how something has been sorry, feline activities down here. Find out how something's been acquired, its dimensions, where it's been exhibited, its conservation history, where it's been published, and for about half of that 3.5 million items, there will be a photograph as well. So I think this is one of the great ways forward for museums internationally, because this is a way of further sharing these important collections. All power to the elbow of anyone who can push that forward in whichever museum they're based in.
That's it's excellent. But I think even here in Bhubaneswar Museum, Capital Museum, there is a very great database they have created of all the paintings and all the palm leaf manuscripts.
Yes.
I hope you had a chance to visit that. And it's really great to know that this has been done, and we should be doing it more. But I still have a little doubt about the secular architecture you spoke of. We do, aren't palaces included in secular architecture?
Of course, yes.
We do have a lot of palaces still existing, and many of them are quite old. And in small towns, at least, I mean, not an art expert or an architect, but I've traveled over Orissa, at least, and parts of a lot of India, and I've seen a lot of existing palaces and homes which still exist today. So my corollary was that do we not have secular architecture before, and that which stood before the Mughals or the British came?
Well, I didn't say the Mughals. I said the first dynasties of the Delhi Sultanate. So we're talking about the 12th century or something, 12th, 13th century. So I'm thrilled to hear that there are examples here in Orissa. I don't know of, I've travelled a wee bit in Orissa, but years and years ago, but I don't know of any that are of pre-12th century date that survive. I may well be wrong. And just to go back to your other point about the manuscript program at the State Museum here, I do remember when that work was being done, and it's a fantastic project, and wonderful that it was done so early on and has been accessible to so many people. And I think it was, I may be wrong, but I think it was funded by the Ford Foundation. And that's a wonderful example of the use of international money being used for the betterment of museums here in India. Yeah, okay, fine. Oh, okay. And if anyone wants me to say.
Are there any more questions, or we can stop here? Okay. So thank you, Richard, for engaging the audience and answering their questions with such verve and such clarity. We drew even a few cats into our conversation, so thank you very much. It was extremely engaging and interesting. So I look forward to reading through the book. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.